Let's get started. Good evening. This is a special meeting of the Village of Lake Bluff Historic Preservation Commission. It is March, it's Ides of March, March 15, 2021. We have, we have primarily one item on our agenda this evening, but before we start, Glenn, if you could call the roll, please.
Certainly. Member Bergman.
Here.
Member Minor.
Here.
Member Gersh.
Here.
Member Nickel.
Here.
Member Liebolt is absent. Member Richardson, Vice Chair Richardson is absent, and Chair Kraus.
Here, we have a quorum, and we have Mr. Schuster, so we are all ready. Second item on the agenda is non-agenda items and visitors. It is our policy. At the beginning of every meeting, we allocate a bit of time for anyone in the audience who wishes to address the commission on something not on the agenda tonight and something that is within our purview. Is there anyone who would like to so address the commission?
Mr. Chairman, I would note that we have, I just would note for the good of the order, we have 4 people observing us on Zoom and then 1 person here in Village Hall as well.
So you're not alone tonight. Things are getting back to normal.
Slowly but surely.
Okay. All right, so our primary agenda item tonight is to continue our discussion of revisions to the village's historic preservation ordinance policies and make some recommendations to the village board. Last week, we did 2 things. We approved, pending review today, an ordinance amending the Historic Preservation Commission or Historic Preservation Ordinance, and we would like to forward that to the village board. That was in your packet, a redlined version with only those 4 changes. I'll just quickly highlight them. Pages 16 and 27, both inserted language, which I think is a great addition, that requires the commission to provide a rationale to the village board when the HPC is recommending an extension of a demolition delay. So instead of simply getting a please extend the demolition delay, it is please extend the demolition delay and here's the reasons why. So it sort of is a history of what the HPC has done that we can transmit in formal form to the village board. So that's page 16 and 27, same provision in 2 different places. Page 17 is making clearer the 3-year window for the HPC to landmark, potentially without owner's consent. That's on page 17. And then page 21 is just tightening up the language on voting for districts, just making clear that it's more than 50% rather than merely 50%. So those 4 are the only changes made to the ordinance. Do we have any?
Can I just ask a question? So regarding the 3-year window, just to confirm, that is reducing the current ordinance, which includes the library for making the recommendation, the museum. And then after 3 years, it will only be the homeowner or the village board.
That's that's close. The big difference there is it's taking away the authority to do it if it's would stay the proceedings under the code. So it's call it the I gotcha, landmarking. The idea is you can't nominate to slow down a process. Is a way to put it in delay. It doesn't mean that the village board, for example, or the owner or anybody else can't come forward to do it. It's just they can't wait until the property's going through the process and then sneak up on you.
So they can't landmark for the purpose of delaying a demolition permit.
Correct. If it would cause the stay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would take away that authority.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So just to restate that is empowering the homeowner more than the current ordinance. So this is an improvement over the current ordinance. Is that a?
It's
Depends on what you
limiting
consider an
the,
improvement, but if
Well,
you're
yeah,
looking for
I guess-
homeowners' rights,
That depends on where your point of view, but
Yeah.
it empowers, it gives,
it limits the power of the village
yeah,
in this particular context.
thank you.
Ben, do we need another motion, or does last week's motion apply to this?
I mean, you could do a motion. I mean, the other thing that you're doing as part of your forwarding is going to be part of the resolution, correct?
Correct.
So kind of do it all at the end as just one resolution, because it's the resolution that kind of, is adopting the recommendation.
Okay,
So if you want to wait to then, that's just fine.
good. We'll do it that way. Okay, ordinance. I can't tell you how many years we've worked on that ordinance, and to kind of put it aside now is a little scary. I wanna-
well,
Okay.
that's good though, Steve.
It still has a journey.
Well, that's true. We've just begun. The second thing that we did last week, which we don't need to review again unless we want to, but we recommended for inclusion in the resolution a list of incentives, to recommend to the village board that incentives and other regulatory consideration be available for landmark properties. And that's on, it's section 3, the first paragraph of the resolution. And I just want to point out that as an important word there in the second sentence, such programs may include, and may is there specifically. This is not an all exclusive list. Hopefully there'll be a dialogue.
Yes.
And more incentives or regulatory considerations hopefully will be part of that general discussion. So that we had talked about last week. Okay, so the last thing before we approve the resolution is to talk about these significant properties. So just for kind of reading, paraphrasing from Glenn's memo, just so everybody in the audience and the commissioners remember where we came from. So the village commissioned 4 separate historic surveys over the course of a decade or more. And each of those historic surveys identified structures by the professional Benjamin Historic Certification Company or something like that. Properties that were considered significant in the history of Lake Bluff, whether architecturally, culturally, socially, contextually. In those 4 surveys, there were quite a few structures, 128, I think, roughly, that were identified in all 4 of those. We then, as a commission, did a couple of things with those. We took out the property, actually there was probably 136, because 8 of those properties had already been torn down. So we took those off the list, of course. 23 of them were already landmarks, so we took them off that list. And 13 of them were already listed on the National Register, either as an individual property or as part of a district. So we took them off the list because they're addressed in different places within the ordinance, those National Register structures. So that left us with 92 significant structures. And I should back up, this exercise was done specifically at the request of our feedback sessions in an effort to provide some degree of certainty for property owners after a reasonable transition time to understand which properties in the village were, for which the village had interest in potentially landmarking, and also to heighten awareness of landmarks within the village. So we have a list now of 92 significant structures. We submitted that list to the commission and published that list last week. We asked commission members to think about and identify, their highest priority structures. And we now have a list that contains 45 structures that at least one of us has identified as a structure that we don't want to lose. Now, let me again back up. Every one of these structures, all of the structures that are significant in the village, and frankly, a few more, are worthy of landmarking. They are special places within the village. We will be, and our resolution identifies that the village will be, the HPC will be communicating with all of those significant structures in an effort to make sure that the property owner understands the significance that our consultants and that some in the village place on preserving those structures. So these are all important structures. What we're trying to do is to create a narrower list of structures that we can focus on in this 3-year time period, that we can focus on and work with property owners to hopefully generate an abundance of voluntary landmarking. So that's why this list has been created. So on the list that you received last week, Friday, you see how many, there were 5 members who completed the survey. You can see how many properties all 5 of the folks responding identified, et cetera, all the way down to only being identified by 1. But this exercise reduced the 92 significant that were listed to 45 total. And I'm going to cut right to the chase. I'm going to suggest, and that we're going to put these structures that we identified, that we recommend today in the ordinance so that everybody understands these are the ones that have the highest priority for us to look at for potential landmarks. And I'm going to suggest that we cut it off, that we say, if 2 or more HPC members identified a structure as important, that goes on our list. That happens to be 24, a little bit more than the double handful that we're looking for, but it is a cutoff that I'm comfortable with. So that's my suggestion, that if 2 or more folks identified it, it goes on the list. If 1 identified it, remember, we're still going to be communicating with those property owners, since they are a significant structure, and will be perhaps, if they so request, we'll be having discussions with them as well. So how does that sound, folks?
Steve, I think that's a great solution. It gets us to the, you said what, 24? Gets us to 24 quickly. Every single house on this list is well worthy of being landmarked. And when we get down into the onesies, all we're talking about is a matter of degree. We're only talking about, a millimeter this way or a millimeter that way. And so all of the houses on the list are well qualified to be nominated as landmarks. And I think showing that at least 2 board members showed an interest in the property at minimum is a good indication that there's, general agreement that these houses should be our primary list. I think this is a great solution.
Do we have any plans to contact people who are on our list of 92 but not in the 24 to
Yes.
encourage them?
Yeah, so section
And
4 of the
offer our aid and so forth?
Section 4 of the resolution says in its last sentence, the village should correspond with these owners. These owners are all the owners of significant houses. So the village should correspond with these owners annually to provide information and encouragement concerning designation of these properties.
Great.
So that's all 92. Oh, there we go.
Well,
Other thoughts, comments?
Steve, I know, well, I think looking at the list and the homes on the list are important, but I think it's also very important how we approach the homeowners about this. The fact that they are in a significant home, because we want them to have really good information right from the beginning about the value of living in a significant home, and I don't know, the incentives. Maybe that's something we all have to work on in the future, but the packet that's going to go with this information to the homeowners.
Yes, we will be.
I think that's critical.
Yeah, so the process steps here, assuming we approve this approach and all the attachments to it, that would go to the village board. The village board would go through their process. I'm sure that we'll be asked to participate in at least part of that process. And then we'll see what their decision is, which way they want to move, but we will, without question, need a robust packet and some really good communication initiatives and materials to share with the whole village, but specifically with the 92 that have been rated as significant. So, yep, we'll do that.
you know, we put together a brochure in the past, and maybe we could revisit putting together a general brochure that, you know, essentially everybody in the village gets, but aimed specifically at the 92 people on the list, or the 92 homes on the list.
Yeah, so I think once the village is done, once the trustees have done what they're going to do, we'll have a full meeting, regular meeting. I don't think we'll have a special meeting for a while, I hope. We'll have a meeting that will discuss what we think we should be communicating. Can we use YouTube? Can we use other online tools? Do we integrate Lake Bluff Online? Do we grab information from the History Museum right away up front and incorporate it? So there's all kinds of things that we need to think about as we communicate with property owners.
Great.
Other comments or questions from commissioners? Do we have comments from, go ahead.
Anything that we can do to emphasize that the people that live in these homes have a voice that we want to hear and participate willingly is, I think, important.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. This is only going to work to the degree that the vast majority of people voluntarily want to begin this process. So absolutely agree with you. I'll give you just one quick personal example. When I was redoing the exterior of my house, it was aluminum gray, cruddy gray aluminum siding when we bought the house. 10 years later, when we had put 3 additions on, we were going to put the skin on, take the aluminum siding off, and put something else on. And I was looking for, I didn't know where to look, didn't know where to ask. But I would have loved to have a photograph that I now have that shows what the original exterior of the house looked like, because I would have tried to match that if I could. And that's the kind of information that I think property owners would be interested in, what their house, was composed of, what it looked like, and maybe will engender that kind of discussion around historic preservation that we're hoping to have. Certainly, new owners or people interested in buying a historic house would certainly most likely be interested in that as well. So there's a lot for us. This is kind of the first step, and there's a lot of other things for us to do to move this forward. Commissioner comments?
I think there may be some people on this call that are on this list.
And I'm going to the audience as soon as there are no other comments from the commissioners. Sort of the way I usually run meetings, Margaret, is that I try to put the issue in front of the commission. I try to have Glenn and Ben, if he's with us, present their points of view. Then the commission kind of makes sure we understand what it is and then get the input from the audience. That's kind of the sequence.
Fair enough.
And then go back to us to discuss.
I didn't mean to overstep.
That's okay. I should have mentioned it before. Process is always important. And the first rule in running a meeting is make sure everybody understands the process before we start. So therefore, let's go to the audience. And is there anyone who'd like to comment on this list or on the process that we've been outlining today?
Mr. Chairman, we do have people making themselves known, so I'll just recognize them in order, if that's all right with you.
That's perfect.
Mr. Lee Sakanoff, and actually, I will give you the ability to send video, so it's going to send you out of our meeting for a second. You'll come back in. Lee, if you're back with us, you can just unmute and turn on your video if you'd like whenever you're ready.
Can you hear me now?
There we go.
Okay.
Thank you.
My name is Lee Sakanoff. I'm here with my wife, Cheryl. We live at 629 Mountain Road. It's one of the houses that was designated in your short list. My first question is, why was the house included?
Well, there's a lot of ways to address that. I think the most straightforward one is to say that the creation of the significant structure list was based on the professional consultants that the village hired over the last 10 years. They included that based on their knowledge and experience of significant structures in other villages. Knowing your home, it's certainly a historic structure. It has been in the village a long time. It is wonderfully maintained on a beautiful location. And really, as you turn that corner, looking down at the ravine and turn the corner to the lake, it gives me, anyway, every time I walk past it, the feeling of what it must have been like to walk in, 1890s Lake Bluff.
And so it's being done based on a feel, is that correct?
No, it's not being done. It's being done by the professional consultants based on their opinion using their criteria. But remember that the criteria is not just architectural. That's one of them. So architectural, it's design. The architect, the person who designed it, potentially the builder, the person or firm that built it, its historic context within the village. So when it was built, what it represents, the context of that structure with respect to the history of the village, or potentially for individuals who may have lived in that structure for a portion of their time in Lake Bluff. So there's a variety of reasons that a home may be considered significant. It's not just, as some people may think, it's not just its intact architectural structure, but it really is all of those things and the context of that structure to the visual streetscape, the built environment of Lake Bluff.
For the record, most of this house, the majority of the house as it now stands, was built in the 70s and 80s, and that's the 1970s and 80s.
It was reconstructed after a fire. I watched that house burn in the late 1970s. It did not burn to the ground, and I watched it being reconstructed. So yes, much of the exterior is new, but the reconstruction was done in the spirit of and using the designs of the original. It looked, at least to me, it might, time is always blurry, but my memory of it before it burned, the part that is original, not the back or some of the sides, is pretty much what it looked like before the fire.
How many of you on this committee are living in one of these significant homes?
Someone asked that last time and the answer is none of us. Now, I also said, and I won't speak for my fellow commissioners, I also said that my home is in a historic area. It has historic context. And once we go through this process of changing the ordinance, I will be looking at and most likely will be landmarking my home voluntarily. In fact, I'll commit that right now. I will landmark my home.
It's my understanding that this is your third attempt to get this through. I also went through the letters, approximately 60 some letters. Seemingly less than 4% of the letters endorse this. Why do you continue to do this?
So not sure where to get the third attempt. We have made revisions to the last revision to the ordinance maybe 10 years ago, other than administrative changes. We
Steve,
did look,
Could I just jump in? I think it was the third attempt to do historic districts, which were not.
yeah, we have in the original ordinance back when it was first proposed, there were districts that were proposed that were removed by the village board. The other portions of the ordinance have not changed substantially since the original ordinance was passed. We did make some modifications and suggested again that districts would be a good idea a time before. That was, again, not accepted. So the approach to districts this time is to have voluntary districts. If a group of neighbors wish together voluntarily to create, to save their streetscape, we think that there should be a process to allow those neighbors to do that. And that's what's in the current ordinance.
I asked Mr. Sacknoff a question.
Sure.
It sounds to me as if you are not in favor of having your home in particular landmarked, and in general having homes landmarked when not initiated by the homeowner. And I'm just curious as to what your objections are.
Well, Janie, thank you for asking. Much of this is economic and much of it is in the spirit of trying to live in a place that wasn't confined to a lot of rules and regulations. I'm going to give you my reasoning for this. My wife and I are in our 70s. Eventually, we won't be able to live in this house, be it a stroke, a heart attack, broken hip, some other calamity that comes with age. That means we're going to have to sell our house, right? I mean, I won't be able to live here. And based on what I see here, it looks like we won't be able to get our money out of the house or on demolition. I don't think someone would want to buy this house for the house value, but more for the land value. And obviously this house, as most houses are in this country, represent a disproportionate amount of someone's net assets. I would need the assets to move into an alternative living space, maybe assisted living, maybe a smaller place, maybe a summer place that doesn't have the challenges of living up north. But according to what I've read here, this is going to cost a great deal of money. It's going to cost me a great deal of money, my wife and I a great deal of money, because this house represents somewhat like a piggy bank. I would need to cash out. And for me to go and try to get that money out of this house while I start to live and may be forced to live in an assisted living facility or in a smaller house, while this house is sitting waiting for demolition that might be up to 1 year, according to what I read, is pretty wasteful. The back of the envelope calculation that I did this afternoon was that for every $1 million of net asset value into the house, you're going to be spending about 10%, $100,000 of holding cost, which would include opportunity cost. It would include taxes, not insignificant, maintenance costs, insurance. That's a pretty big burden, especially when there are other issues, perhaps doctor bills, medical bills, assisted nurses, that have to be dealt with. And I think this is punitive.
Thank you.
So let me respond to some of those.
Sure.
Or we can have a dialogue around some of those. You're right, we're proposing for a landmark structure, a potential 1-year delay in demolition. And quite frankly, for the significant structures in the village, the anchors, we call them, we are concerned about total demolition and something new being built there. That is an increase in the delay. We've experienced the reason why are we suggesting a delay? First of all, we believe your home and many others in the village are important remembrances of the history of the village, and that I personally believe very strongly that there are buyers for historic homes. I was one a long time ago. I love the fact that my house had a history. I love the fact it was falling down, like, you know, many houses at home when you buy them. It took me 25 years to get it to where I wanted it to be. But I believe there are people who are interested in the house, not just the land value, but the house. And for those important structures in the village, we feel, the commission feels, that it is appropriate to work with the property owner and a potential buyer for alternatives to complete demolition. So are there financial incentives that may make it more economically feasible for a buyer, instead of tearing a house down, to modify that structure? By the way, we're not concerned at all with the interior of a home. People can do whatever they want with their interior. We're concerned with features of the exterior. In your house, it would be interesting because there are certain portions of that house that are, you know, 1980s, just like the portions of my house that are 1980s. But I truly believe that the village should be able to have that conversation around alternatives to tear downs for those structures that are significant within the village. If we don't do that, I fear we run the risk of losing that historic context and losing the reason that lots of people tell us they moved to Lake Bluff, because of its charm, because of its varied and unique and historic housing style. So we're trying to do this in a way that doesn't impinge on the economic value of the property owner. I'm your age, I understand. We're not going to be here forever either. I would love to maximize the value of my home. Personally, I think I can do that by discussing with a future owner its historic nature and character. Perhaps not, but we're not restricting a property owner from doing what they want with their property. Property owners can do what they want. What this ordinance is doing, and what the Historic Preservation Ordinance did from its beginning 15 years ago, is impose a breathing period, a delay, so that there's community input, so that neighbors can understand. That's why the signs in front of houses are going to be torn down. Can understand there's a change happening, and so that there can be a discussion about, can we work together to do something different than total teardown? We're not as concerned with buying a house and putting additions on. That's what happens in the modern world. But we want to see what we can do for those landmarks, for those selected structures that are landmarks, and frankly, for all the significant structures, if it's possible to have that dialogue and change the outcome. We're not looking to be punitive. We are looking to be respectful of the tradition of the village and the history of our homes.
Well, thank you. I've spent a good dollar trying to keep the charm of Lake Bluff. No one's compensated me for it, I don't think. To be quite fair with you, I'll give you a little history of this house. When the house went on the market, I was the third person within the day to put an offer in. Got an engineer to come in, and within 24 hours, he said, "Don't buy this house. Too much work, too expensive." The second day, the second owner, second in line, came in, got his engineer within the week. Too expensive. You don't know what you're getting into. In fact, that person went out, bought a house in Western Lake Bluff, tore that little house down and built a Victorian house. Very efficient. That was left with me, and I spent money, and I spent 50% more than we had budgeted. Because as you know, when you start tearing into the walls and start tearing into the basement and start seeing the sag and the mold, it's going to be a little more, if not a lot more, than what you might think. Most people are aware of that, Steve. Most people are aware of that. So I have already put in a lot of money, and thank you very much for your compliments. We get quite a few, and I appreciate the positive feedback. But we have a charming house, and I wouldn't leave it unless I have to. But the fact of the matter is, I have spent a great deal of money maintaining it. The windows are single pane. The insulation is newspaper. No one is compensating me for utility bills that are 50% higher than a normal house of this size. No one is helping me eradicate the cave crickets in the basement who come because the basement is made out of bricks and not concrete. And now you're saying, no different if I had gone to the bank and say, "Sir, Mr. Banker, I would like to take out my $1 million because I have to live in a smaller assisted living place with a nurse round the clock." And the bank says, "No problem, we'll get your $1 million out of the bank. Come back in a year." I don't think you're being fiscally responsible to the many people in this town who have these quote unquote significant homes. Thank you for your help. Thank you for your involvement.
Thanks for your comments. Do we have others?
Yes, sir. So Mr. Sakanoff, again, this will take you out of our meeting and back in. And Frank and Heather Klepich, I believe, again, you'll be taken out of our meeting and back in. When you rejoin, you'll be able to send audio and video. Good evening.
Good evening.
Hi.
Good evening, commissioners. My name is Heather Klepich. I'm here with my husband, Frank. We live at 420 Sunrise, and we both have a few questions and comments. My first question is, should someone desire to be removed from this list of significant homes, what would be the process for doing that?
There isn't a process. I mean, it is a list that independent consultants put together. And it's been, your house, for example, has been on that list for 15 years. I think whatever the first survey was.
Okay.
So, you're right down the street from me, so I'm in the same situation. So it's been on that list for the longest of any structures in the village. And we had candidly, it is a list that consultants have given to the village, and there isn't a process for taking it off. I mean, it's just not one of it. You're recommended, you're nominated in effect by the consultants for consideration as a special place in Lake Bluff.
While I respect that, you mentioned that this was a list that was compiled 15 years ago. So times change, considerations for what's historic and what is not. And you often talk about in all the meeting minutes that I've read about architectural significance the architect, the builder, historical significance, social significance. There's no architect of record for our home. I'm not seeing it meets any of this criteria. So the more recent studies that were done does not have our home on the list. So I'm guessing that that's the most current and most reliable data. So I would encourage you or ask you, why isn't there a process for people being removed? Because I think it is something that should be included in the ordinance.
Sure. So a couple of threads there. One is that the 4 surveys that have been done were in 4 different areas of the village. So they didn't look at the whole village. They looked first at the east side, second at the southeast and the estate area, et cetera. So over that 15-year period of time, 4 separate surveys, we finally covered the entire village. So they only looked at our houses once, okay?
Okay.
The second thing is absolutely times change. I remember when that addition was put on your house. I remember when the elevator was added. I remember the conversations with property owner at the time about the kind of brick that they were going to use and what they wanted. We were friends with them and toured the house as it was being constructed. But you're right, times change. So that's why there's a process. Just because you're on a list doesn't mean that a process ends. It's conceivable if the commission would want to potentially pursue historic landmarking. There's a conversation with a property owner and there's a discussion of such things as what might have changed over time. Is this still, or is it a significant structure? Should there be, so there's a dialogue with the property owner. The goal is to have property owners voluntarily landmark their homes where they see there's an advantage to them. That is our goal, that is our desire. However, there may be a few situations where for those very special anchors within the village, we may need to have more serious discussions around landmarking. But you're absolutely right. Times change, conditions change. There may be an insensitive addition that a prior owner had done to a property that put it into a different category. So those things get discussed if there is a continued discussion around potential landmarking.
Okay. Having said all of that, I think as a commission whose client, if you will, is the village of Lake Bluff and its residents. You know, I've looked at all these lists. I think it is imperative that you as a commission or a group, a board, give a more specific understanding to these property owners of why we were on this list. You didn't give an adequate response in my mind to the previous owner on Mountain View, Saginaw, and I don't have one for our house either. So I don't think it's reasonable to be on a list without knowing exactly why. And the answer of, well, you're on a Benjamin survey from 15 years ago, quite frankly, doesn't cut it because it does impact us. So
Yeah,
again,
so-
would respectfully ask that you also add that to your list.
Sure. You know, and I hear you, I understand that. It's not perfect, but we were faced with, how do we start this process? How do we start this journey of making sure that we have identified the significant structures and worked with property owners, first of all, so they understand the significance of their home. I can't tell you the number of property owners who have come in, or new owners, or real estate agents, or builders who have come into a significant structure with a demolition permit and said, I had no idea this had any value at all. To me, it's just an old house. And we understand that, but that's the data that we had to start with. The survey data is what we had, and that is what we started with. It isn't final. It isn't anything other than a recognition that this is a significant structure and that people need, the property owners hopefully accept and understand that, or we have discussions about it. Sure, there could be a decision not to pursue a significant structure for landmarking, in effect, takes the property off of the list. But it's, you know, I don't want to be.
I just think it's reasonable that if you create a list, you have to be able to justify why homes are on it. And just saying it's on the Benjamin list isn't adequate to me. There needs to be more.
Okay.
But my husband
we
Frank
can-
also has some things that he'd like to add.
And we do plan on communicating with all of the significant property owners and identifying the reasons that we've unearthed both through Benjamin and through historic research as to why that property potentially is on the list. I'm sure we'll find some that shouldn't have been there in the first place, and you know, we'll fix it. But again, it was a beginning point. Hi, Frank.
Hi, Steve. So, you know, I think on that, just to follow up on what Heather was asking you about, as a commission that is deciding on the fate of people's homes with this, I think that you should be able to pull up, you know, as the different homeowners bring up these objections, pull up what the criteria was for each different homes that was on the Benjamin list. In other words, you go back to Susan Benjamin, and you should be able, for each home, say this is the criteria. It was a Harry Lindenberg house, you know, or this was a famous contractor, or this was a famous person that had historical significance in Lake Bluff. I've worked on a number of historical landmarks in the U.S. My office is the Monadnock Building in Chicago. It's the oldest skyscraper in Chicago, and it was built by the same architects who had involvement in the World's Fair. So I understand, and I know Bill Donnell, who owns the building personally. I do understand what criteria is required to become a piece of architecture that is preserved. Our house at 420 Sunrise does not have any known architect who built the house, and I do not know of any builder or known builder who built our house as well. But with that said, Steve, I do believe that there should be some protection of homes in Lake Bluff. I don't think that putting them on an historical, some sort of, you know, haywire historical list, you know, is going to protect it. I think there needs to be a committee, you know, a real commission that reviews the home that's going to potentially be torn down, and reviews the architecture that the property is going to take as a new house is built on it. I think that's the way to preserve our village. You know, have people go through a committee. Lake Forest does this, and I've been in front of that historic commission many times, and it's done very professionally in a business-like way, and it's not done in sort of a subjective way. It's very, very objective. I've been in front of the board once in Lake Bluff in 1995, and had a bizarre experience there. And this was for my house on the house I built on Evanston and North Avenue. And I was trying to get an attached garage and not lose the square footage to attach it, because you got a bonus if you detach the garage. I could have saved like a 200-year-old oak tree on the property. And that commission decided that they weren't going to give it to me. So I detached the garage because square footage is more important. And the woman who headed that board came up to me afterwards, and she said, I voted against you because I know you're going to keep the tree and detach the garage, and or attach the garage. And I said, that's not true, you know. And you know, it's that kind of thinking that really affects people's feelings, their economic situation, you know, and their homes in Lake Bluff. Now, on the protection side, and you know, I just want to support this, is that since 2008 and 2009, I don't think there's one architect, a well-known architect, that's come into this village. The builders that have been building in the village are tract home builders, U.S. Shelter, Emerald. Those are tract home builders that came here because they thought they were going to make a lot of money, but a lot of them did get stuck with the properties afterwards. And they were building homes that were, the cost of those homes were so low that it brought all of our property values down. So I do understand protection. We need that. But I don't think telling someone that their home is an historical home is the way to do it. I think we need to develop a real architectural commission that reviews designs and also decides whether the new architecture is going to fit on that lot. That's my strong opinion about this. And it's been an opinion I've always had. I've talked to George Russell about this when he was the engineer of the village, and several of the village managers as well. The other point I'd like to make is that as people go into higher education, I think that if they were to take at least one art history or architectural history class as their elective, I think our whole built environment would change, because they would understand what is architecture and what is not, you know? And I, based on some of the renovations I've seen on some of the beautiful old homes, they're destroyed. I would not even consider them historic anymore, because the people have just destroyed it. They don't really have a real architect. They don't want to pay for a real architect, and they just have somebody, you know, screw up the house. Our house, the addition that you mentioned in '88 was done by Kendler, you know, and that there, if you go to the area of Lake Forest that he's done a lot of his homes, it's some of the worst architecture I've ever seen. So you can't tell me that a Kendler addition is adding to the value of our home. Secondly, the Leduc addition that you know, everybody seems to know we have an elevator. I don't know why. I don't understand why that's the case, but that was done by some harebrained designer who screwed up our whole kitchen. I've been struggling with it for the last 20 years, and it's just terrible. It was just terrible for the house. Now we have cleaned it up and made our house beautiful. I mean, we've cleaned up the landscaping, we've made the interiors beautiful, but we struggle with some of the stuff that happened by people who are not architects and who did not understand architecture. And a lot of the villages like that, we need, you know, we don't need somebody to dictate, you know, what we can do and what we can't do with our homes. We need some people on a board who understand architecture, who can give good direction to the village. That's what we need. So, you know, I would prefer that our house is taken off the list, but let me ask you two questions. We have one member that's saying that our house is an historical piece of architecture. What does that mean for us with one member?
It means it's not going to be, from a practical perspective, we identified the short list of properties that we are definitely going to be contacting property owners and talking about whether they're interested in voluntary landmarking. So you're not on that list. You're still a significant structure. So we haven't done the process yet, but I presume you will receive communication from the village around the impact of significance, around the impact of potential future landmarking, both positive and negative. And if those property owners are interested in pursuing voluntary landmarking, that's the opportunity to do that.
And if we're not, what happens then?
If you're not, you're not. You know, the intent here, we're not interested in forcing landmarking on property owners generally who are not interested. There's frankly a handful of structures that I don't want to lose in the village. I don't think anybody wants to lose them in the village. Those are ones that have a pedigree, if you would, some architectural, some historic. And those are really the symbols of the built environment of Lake Bluff of the past. But the vast majority of properties, we hope we can talk with property owners and at least have a good dialogue, at least so people understand the context of their home, so that when it comes time to sell, when it comes time to do an addition, they'll think of working with the village. So let me get an address to one of your points. With your prior home, the tree conversation, that was with the Plan Commission or the Zoning Board of Appeals. So, and candidly, that sounded like a horrible meeting and a horrible discussion. What we are very specifically in our resolution to the village board is recommending that the village board increase incentives and regulatory consideration so that it becomes the policy of the village for those kinds of situations where a change or a waiver of a particular zoning requirement would allow the flexibility that the owner and the builder need to do what they need to do with a home and save that home, rather than arbitrarily applying a standard that doesn't fit the lot, that doesn't fit the home. And it's important because of its historic context. So we're absolutely trying to address that need so those don't happen. And so that current and future property owners understand that they may have some flexibility in upgrading their home. So that's one thing. The second thing, we absolutely agree with you that we need design standards. We've been recommending both material standards, which the village doesn't have either, and potential design standards in rather limited circumstances. So this would be for significant potentially landmark structures within the village. So that, because when we get, when we're having a hearing around a tear down of a structure, property owners, neighbors often come to us and say, well, I don't know how to evaluate this because I don't know what's going to be there. And under the current operations of the village, there is no process for mandating a review other than the normal building code process that you're so familiar with. There is no process in place. I absolutely agree that needs to be done. That's not this process, that's another one, and I agree with you. I'll be happy to help you make that, if we can, convince people to make that happen.
So thank you for that answer, but as a resident of this village for 31 years now, which may not be a lot to some people, and when I first moved here, I never thought I would be a resident of any village for 31 years, so it is a long time. You know, I do think that recently, and I would say in the last 10 years, you know, I would caution the board, the village board of trustees, to not for a lack of a better term, look like Big Brother, you know, and decide things for people. And we've experienced that in some of the board of trustees meeting, especially around some of these areas of chickens and BRBs and things like that. It seemed like we were not heard. We were just told by the people who are running the commissions, by running the board, that this is what we believe, this is what we think needs to be done. And some of your answers, Steve, you know, to me and to Lee, where this is what I believe and this is what I think needs to be done. I mean, this meeting's being recorded. You can go back and listen to yourself. Now, we've also heard that on other boards, and there is a wave of people in the village who are starting to really see this. And hopefully there will be a change on April 6th. You know, maybe there won't, because the I believers and we believe what's best for the village have a very strong contingent here in the village. So I guess my biggest issue is that be careful of being Big Brother here and deciding what you think you know best for the village. And that's why I think a board, a real architectural commission of architects, you know, maybe a city planner, someone like that would be much better suited to control the aesthetic of the village and preserve its uniqueness, rather than a board stating, we're going to put an historical, you know, legislature in here, and we're going to decide what people's the fate of their homes are, you know, their economic impact. And it does create an economic impact, and make it architectural, make it real. You know, our home has no known architect, again, no known contractor. We have a Kendler edition and we have a LeDuc edition, and those are not architects, you know, and I don't think they really help the house. If I had gotten to this house before 1998, there would be some major differences to it that would make it much more architectural. Now, I've done what I could, and everybody loves our house. You know, I mean, we love our house, we love the location, but it's not architectural. It's just not architectural.
Yeah, and I don't mean to come off as a Big Brother. I mean to come off as somebody who loves this village and wants to have as the legacy of those of us who live here now, the ambiance of the village 50 years from now. And I fear, as I've seen, you know, over the 20-year time period, it's in cycles, as you know, it's building cycles that before you get a building cycle, you get a demolition cycle. You see lots of structures that you just wonder, why in the world couldn't that have been saved? Why couldn't, that's such an important, and I don't, you know, again, I apologize if I come off as the big brother here, but I just want to be able to have a process that allows for those discussions in a community setting as to, you know, those structures that we think are that important for the village. And it's more than just, it's more than architecture. You know, there's some structures that I think, so I certainly believe are important because of who lived there. You know, there's not many original camp meeting structures left in the village. There's a couple. There's not a lot of original structures around the estate era. There's some. So there's a lot of things that we look at. And by the way, the elevator, I think it got everybody's attention because I think it was the first one in the village, I think, when it was first put in.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we agree, you know, just to not to prolong this, I think we both agree that we would like the village to be preserved. I just don't think that a board should, you know, make a decision on people's homes just on sort of a high level big brother way. I think that it should be done by a commission of people who understand architecture and can guide this village, and all the additions that are done, or all the changes that are done, are guided by board that preserves the village and who understands architecture and the history of the village. A commission, you know, that reviews each individual building individually, not just some blanket rule that says, well, you're historic and now you can't tear down your house. I don't think homes should be just torn down, you know, whimsically. But we're inviting tract builders in the village, and those are the people that are going to destroy our village. You don't see a Larry Booth, you don't see a Frank Klepich, you don't see a Dave Polton in Lake Bluff anymore. There's a reason for that, because the clients that come to us don't want to be part of this. So think about that, and let's think about another way to control our village environment and the streetscapes here.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Glenn, do we have others?
I'm not, oh, spoke too soon. Once again, we will trade out for Miss Deborah Fisher.
Hi, thank you. I guess I just have a couple questions that I'd like to ask. So for clarity, it's 5 or 6 people or so that have picked the 24, that have essentially created the list of 24 homes?
So the long list was created by the Susan Benjamin Company, the professionals that the village hired, using criteria. The Historic Preservation Commission, so that's the big list. We took out the homes that unfortunately have been demolished. We took out the homes that are already landmarked. We took out the structures that are part of the register. So that left 94. Of those 94, these commission members, and this was at the request of folks, you were at that first meeting, where it first came up, that we want some certainty, clarity as to which structures are going to be landmarked or not in the future. So that's the idea of creating the short list of structures that we will be having conversations with. It's also the idea of putting a 3-year sunset period on those discussions so that there is certainty over which structures we're interested in and which structures and for how long we're going to have those conversations. So the commission members, most of the commission members looked through the list and identified ones. I asked for the double handful for folks to identify 20. Some people did less, some people did more. Came up with a list, and we've now recommended where I'm discussing the if 2 or more, since that got us, around the double handful of the 24 homes. So that was the process.
Okay, thanks. And of those 24 that you're now focused on, well, first off, for the remaining, they will be kind of in limbo for the next up to 3 years, whether or not they will.
For the remaining, it is unlikely that we will, I can say we will not initiate landmarking activity for those structures. We will hope to have conversations with all of these homes, with the property owners, just to make sure that they know they know where to go for resources, or if they have interest in learning more about their home, we can help them do the research around their home. We've got lots of information on these properties.
Okay.
So yeah, so it's, which ones are we going to be potentially actively working? The goal is voluntary landmarking. The goal is to get property owners to do this voluntarily and have discussions around that.
Okay, so of those 24 houses, can I just ask how many? I know Mr. Bergman at one point had mentioned that every year about 25 letters are sent out to people encouraging them to landmark their homes. Of those 24 that are being identified as the anchors for the village, potentially, have all of those owners over time pretty much been invited to participate in the process, or are these?
So, and again, I was on the Plan Commission a long time ago that was charged with the responsibility of creating the Historic Preservation Commission. I was the first chair of the Historic Preservation Commission, and I served in that role for a while, 10 years, and then resigned from the board. And then I'm now back on. In that whole time frame, I only know of once that we sent letters out. I know that in the interim there were more. So I don't know. There isn't an annual sending. There isn't 25 letters that go out every year. It goes out when there's, often when there's a new survey that's been identified. But I will say that for homes on the east side of the village that were included in the first survey, it is likely that whoever the property owner was 15 years ago had received written communication of and requesting, asking if they're interested in learning more about landmarking.
Okay, and then go ahead.
Go ahead, no, that's right, go ahead.
Okay, so, and then I'm just curious whether you have any sense of the 24, whether most have lived in their home a long time, have not lived in their home a long time? No,
only for people that I know or for homes that I know that I walk by all the time. But we didn't look at that. So I wouldn't know how many are property owners that have lived there for less than 10 years, for example. We'll find out, certainly.
Okay.
I know that a lot of the homes that are on that list have had, great renovations or maintenance done to their property, but we'll find out more.
Okay, and then last question is just I know we have the ordinance in place that has the 6 month delay already. You feel that adding another 6 months to that really will give you results better than just prolonging the inevitable? You think minds will be changed in that 6 months of delaying people?
So the answer is yes. Yeah, but let me back up. That delay, we're proposing 365-day maximum delay. By the way, the majority of that would require the village board to make that decision. We think this is such an important decision that affects, the economics of property owners, of homeowners, that the HPC doesn't have the authority. And I'm forgetting the actual numbers. Do we have 90 days, Glenn, and then the rest of it the village board has, or do we have 120? But the bulk of the delay is at the village board level, not at the HPC level. And I lost my train of thought. It happens. Where was I going with that?
Well, my question was just whether the additional 6 months you feel gives a return.
Yes, so we do think that the additional 6 months will give the village more opportunity for creative discussions with the property owner. And those creative discussions could be involving zoning. It could be involving finding another buyer. It could be working with the property owner in understanding what their needs are and are there ways that the village can facilitate that. It could be applying incentives, financial incentives that may make the project more feasible for saving rather than tearing down. But yes, we do feel that the additional time gives the village more time. And this only applies, that's where I was going. The delay only applies to landmarks. Right now, there are 23 landmarks. So 23 plus however many in 3 years are created. That's all. The 365 applies only to landmark structures. Doesn't apply to others. Different potential delays, but it doesn't. The 365 is only to landmarks.
Okay, great, thank you. I guess I just would really, I still believe that that's an excessive request, I guess. And I guess I would just love to really encourage you all to really have the dialogues up front. Don't wait till the people are selling their houses. See if zoning can be changed for the future. Do things preemptively so that those properties do not get down to the point where we are at the nth hour trying to keep delaying this. I just think that there's got to be so many more things that can be done proactively with dialogue that will not end up being more punitive as it may end up being with unintended consequences.
Absolutely agree with you on that. That's why we need the list so that we can, so that the list is a vehicle for us to have those conversations. It is depressing when we get a new owner or an old owner of a home that has not been maintained, that has essentially been gutted, that has lost a lot of its economic value because it wasn't maintained. And it's a historic structure and you get sick over it. Because as you said, if there would have been interventions done in time, that situation might be very different.
Okay, so this would allow you to have that kind of flexibility, allow the village to have that flexibility up front, as opposed to whenever you start the dialogue, as opposed to when somebody's going to die. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So if there's all kinds of potential ways this would work, but if there's a property owner who bought the house realizing, like many of us did, bought the house realizing it needed to be updated to support it, the conversations with that property owner before they start finalizing their plans is critical. And that property owner needs all the information, all the incentives, needs to understand the lay of the land, if you would, as they're working through their addition or as they're working through their rehab. Same thing with a buyer who is coming into a buyer who's coming into the village, whoever that buyer would be, if it's a developer or not, would need to understand that this is considered to be a significant structure within the village, but there is flexibility in the way the village deals with modifications to historic structures that should be understood before final decisions are made. So yeah, we think we're talking on the same page here.
Okay, well, I guess just because in looking at that list from some of the people that I know on it do seem to be older. I don't think they're going to be planning to do renovations or anything, but if some of this structure can be put in place to enable them when they're ready to sell, not when they're forced to sell because of, as Mr. Sacknoff said, a stroke or a hip or something else. I mean, if the things can already be put on, perhaps that would be more helpful than trying to do it in a rush afterwards.
Absolutely.
Buyers and, sellers at that point. Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Can I interrupt for just a second and respond to a couple things? Deb, one concept is to provide enough tools so that you're not put in the position of selling a house only as a tear down. And we have a number of houses that are purely marketed as just a tear down. And this will provide an avenue to say, well, you might, a buyer might buy it to tear it down, but there's this other avenue of saying, well, the historic preservation people would really like to talk to a potential buyer and talk about some zoning changes or whatever it is required in order to make that house saleable, rather than saleable as a rehab instead of saleable only as a tear down.
Right. I guess what I'm just saying, Paul, is that I think it would be functional, perhaps, to consider having those conversations with that buyer today, and just say, hey, when you get to the point of needing to sell your house or choosing to sell your house, let's have this already in place, whether it's a logical zoning thing that would increase the value, whatever. I've read some of the correspondence. I think there was some good information about people who have, obviously invested a lot over 20 years, 30 years, whatever.
Right.
Maybe it is a give back to them that they don't have to go through an uncertainty time period with a seller. They're already ready to go, that we can, as realtors, say, hey, this house already is zoned for X, that will encourage renovation or will encourage whatever. So I guess that's kind of what I'm thinking in terms of preemptively helping the process.
Yeah, that to me is a great idea. It is, that will be at the village board level. I mean, we're going to be recommending that all those ideas get discussed, and hopefully I would hope there'll be a group of individuals that would include the real estate community as well as current property owners, that identifies those kinds of very creative structures to give some certainty to the property owner. I like that idea a lot, actually. Paul, I think I stepped on you again.
Can I also make another comment about the list? Mr. Sacknoff, Mr. Klepage, all have said, what's this list? And so I think it bears stating that the list process that Ms. Benjamin goes through, the Benjamin Consulting, is the grading or the evaluation process that's designed by the National Park Service. So these are national standards. There's 17 of them in general form, and they are there's lots of literature out there about how you interpret the standards and how you apply them. There's always conversation about the application of the standards, but I want people to know, or the listeners who are still there, to know that this isn't just a process that some consultant dreamed up. It's part of a nationally organized, nationally developed review process, and that houses in Lake Forest and Highland Park and everywhere else across the country, Boston and New York, houses all across the country are graded and reviewed by the same standards. And so I think it's important that when people say, oh, it's a bunch of commissioners just picking houses off of a list, well, it's a list that's been well considered, and it's been developed by a person who has, I think, about 30 years of experience in writing up houses and placing houses on lists like this. She does this for a living, has been doing it for quite some time. So I just wanted to address that issue, just so people are aware that the list has got a little bit of substance to it. Thank you.
Yeah, and that, and maybe our communication, certainly, and you described the process much more elegantly than I did, but maybe we actually communicate to the property owners what those categories were.
Yeah.
And, so that there is more understanding of how they got on the list to begin with. And,
yeah,
if there have been significant changes since then, we need to think about that too.
Right.
Okay, any other comments from the audience? Glenn?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we do.
Okay.
Just a moment.
Okay.
Paul, I would just ask, what are those specific criteria that we meet at 420 Sunrise that that Susan Benjamin included us on the list? Do you know what those criteria are?
Frank, I'm sorry, I don't. To be perfectly honest, I'm not that familiar with the changes that have occurred to your house. And so I would have to go back and read her report. If you want to see the 17 standards, they're already outlined in our existing HPC statute. They're also outlined in the Lake Forest statute if you're wandering around in the Lake Forest website. So the standards are pretty well known and pretty well published and whatnot. And I'm not entirely sure how she did it. It would be probably worthwhile. I think all of those reports are on the Lake Bluff website. So it's something that you can research by going into the Lake Bluff website and figuring out which report your house is listed in and finding out what the description is on that.
Yeah, we've tried to go into that report, and it doesn't outline the specific criteria that she had for our house. And I guess that I guess my suggestion to the board is when you do approach individual owners, that you know specifically what criteria their house is meeting. I don't think it should be on us to find that out. I mean, you guys are trying to sell this to owners. I think it's up to you guys to do that.
I haven't looked at your house because I wasn't anticipating having a conversation with you tonight. So
yeah,
I have to apologize for that. So
yeah, but I'm just saying that when you do go out to the homeowners with your list, the list of homeowners, and try to convince them that they should voluntarily include their house in this historic part of Lake Bluff, that you're able to say what is the criteria that included them on the list in the first place. I could not find it. All I found was that she did a report, but the report does not have anything, specifically what of those 17 criteria makes our house part of the list, or Lee Saginauf's house part of the list, or any of those people, they're on the list. I'm sure they don't, not every house meets all 17. Do they meet 1 criteria, 2 criteria, 10 criteria? What is that? And I think as a board, that's really determining, I think, value of homes and people's homes, that you should really know what those criteria are. Maybe when you review that, you may take us off the list.
It's just a reasonable request for any homeowner that's been placed on a list, is to know why. That's it.
And to that, I agree. And to the degree that we have specific information, we will certainly, it behooves all of us to share that specific information, plus additional information that regarding, or support for that information regarding people or history or culture. So yeah, we need to do that. We need to be, have as much, whatever information we have, we need to share with property owners. There's no reason not to.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Any comments or questions from the commissioners?
Just confirming that there's no one else who has requested to speak, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Hearing no questions from the commissioners, I would like to move this process to the village board, and in order to do that, we need to approve the resolution. That's the form that this is in, and just to go over that resolution again. There's certain background information in the whereas statements. There is the request, or there is a recommendation for the village board to consider the changes to the historic preservation ordinance that we had talked about and approved last week. There is the request to study, hopefully with the HPC and broader community, incentives, both financial and regulatory incentives. There is the creation, the identification, the recognition that there is a significant list, and that individuals in the village who live in a significant property should be communicated with. And then finally, there is the list of what we're now suggesting are 24 properties. So that's the context of the resolution, and I would entertain a motion to approve that recommendation, forwarding the required information to the village board.
I so move.
I'll
Jane,
second.
motion and a second. Discussion, questions?
Just a general comment that we had, the list was published more broadly or more specific, I guess, with this motion. We had several listening sessions. Today, I think, was the most dynamic of conversation with 2 homeowners. So it's imperative that the homeowners participate. And I think there was a bias tonight, at least that's what I heard, to be informed and not to make choices without their willing participation. So I have said it before, it still makes me very uncomfortable that there is the potential that this landmarking could occur without the participation of homeowners. But I'll leave it at that.
I hear you. Just one clarification. There will be if we do go down the road, and I'm not sure we will, and I don't want to go down the road of involuntary landmarking. And if we do, it would be for a very, very small number of properties. The property owner will participate. That's part of the requirements.
Or their designee, right?
Or their designee, correct. Especially in those circumstances where a property owner isn't a person. But there may be some limited number of properties that we may consider for involuntary landmarking. And again, that's this 3-year time period. I hope we don't need to go there. I hope the conversations I'm sure they'll be very interesting, just like tonight's work. But that's where we're sitting. So we have a motion and a second. Do we have other questions, comments from the commissioners? A roll call vote, please.
Certainly. So 2 comments. First, the order is random. Second, in this instance, it is a majority of those present to pass the motion. So even though you only have 5 members, just 3 would be an affirmative motion, or what the motion would succeed with 3. With that said, Member Church,
Yes.
Member Bergman,
Yes.
Member Minor,
No.
Member Nickel,
Yes.
Chair Kraus,
Yes.
motion carries.
Okay. I'm not sure when this will be on the village board agenda. Glenn will be sending out information to all of us. I imagine there'll be some form of a presentation, but more to come. Any commissioners report? We have, depending on where this goes, we've got a lot of work in putting a package together to communicate with property owners. So just look at that as future work. Staff report, any staff?
Well, can I ask a question? How can we help with that messaging?
So certainly it's having a good group discussion around what that looks like, what media we use, how we actually put that communication material together, the frequency, the distribution media. Do we have group meetings? Do we have individual meetings? Do we make phone calls? Do we do it by mail? Do we do it by email? So all of those, we need to put a plan together. And then part of the plan is the actual components of the media, the communication plan. And there it's possible that some of us could help in actually drafting the communication pieces. So someone drafting a communication piece around incentives, for example.
We did that.
someone, you know, the pluses and minuses of it. So all of those things, and the more that we can do, the more that the commission can do, just because our staff is limited in their time, because we're not, I know it's hard to believe, but we're not the only thing they work on. So the more that we can do, the faster we'll get this done. I think everybody wants to do this relatively quickly. We won't start until we get direction from the village board.
But I also agree that it's important to not start until we have something that is really helpful to the homeowners. And that, because I think if information goes out too quickly that is not clearly explained, then it leaves room for all kinds of pieces to be filled in.
Yeah.
Because I think there's even some messaging that could go in the journey to the board for approval that would help clarify.
I agree.
It certainly will be something more than a form letter, because we'll want to include information for individual homeowners specific to their home.
We certainly will want that. I think I agree with Margaret too, that even before we get to the individual packet for the homeowner, it might be very helpful for all of the residents in the village to hear from the commission or to hear from the village board as to what happened, what that means, and what the next steps are. So sort of here's what happened, here's what's going to happen, so be prepared and look for these documents. So I think we need to get the village board, the first meeting with the village board, so we get a sense of direction. And we may, when we meet next month, we may want to start pulling together a communication for the village in anticipation of having a packet pulled together.
And what is the timeline for the board? When will this?
I believe so. Just to be candid, the sitting village board twice authorized us to do this, asked us to revise, to look at possible changes to the historic preservation ordinance. So a big part of me says we need, this village board at a minimum needs to decide if they are going to act on this or if they're going to wait until there is, you know, other people that are sitting. But I think we owe it to the village board. We're fulfilling their request to us by giving them this information, and then they decide if they're going to take it now, which would mean next month or shortly thereafter, or wait until after the election. That's their decision to make. But I think it's going to be presented to the village board pretty quickly. Then we'll see what they do with it.
Yeah.
So in the next, I'm sorry, the next meeting or the
Don't know.
second meeting? Okay.
I think their next meeting is Monday, a week from today, I think. Must be, because it's not today.
So we
That's
can't.
correct, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, Glenn?
I said that's correct, Mr. Chairman. Here, I can.
Okay.
Our guest left a little while ago, so perhaps this will make me a bit more discernible.
Okay.
The village board's next meeting is on March 22nd.
Okay. Paul, you had a comment?
Yeah, if that's less than 14 days, so I don't know that we can get on the agenda, get published on the published agenda in that time, so.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
this is Drew Irvin.
Hi, Drew.
Hey, I think what my intentions would be is it's not uncommon to take a report from this body or the PCCBA or other advisory bodies under my report to share that a recent action has taken place. And is there a direction that they would like to see, like whether they want to have it referred to a committee of the whole meeting where they can have a more workshop an item, or put it on the agenda for consideration of the next village board meeting. So what my intentions are is to share it a week from today to the village board under my report, and if they have specific direction, then we can let you know what shakes out from there.
Great.
Okay.
So that allows the topic to be introduced and then it could be voted on at the next meeting. Is that right? The April meeting?
That would be the earliest. I suspect that they would want to, I think most the way thus far with these suggested changes to the historic preservation regulations have been done. They've had conversations at the committee of the whole first before it appeared on the agenda for formal consideration.
And then a first and second reading, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's good to know, Drew, and we'll just wait, and we'll be ready whenever the village board wishes to have a dialogue.
Great.
In the meanwhile, with the summer of 125+1 coming up, and here I'm sort of wearing my history museum hat a little bit, as do several of us on the commission here. Could we, well, let me preface this by saying, back in the day when we used to, which wasn't that long ago, we used to actually have docents, of which I was one, lead tours around Lake Bluff. It was always very interesting to me that there were always at least 2 or 3 interesting tidbits that people who were walking on the tours would tell us that I didn't know about a house I was talking about on a tour. So as we are seeking to gather information to present to homeowners, this might be an opportunity to have a couple of sessions where people could just come forward and tell us what they know about homes in town, about social, I'm really talking about social history here. And
Oral history.
Yeah, there's all kinds of things we can do. We just have to, I think we need to let the village board at least have their initial reaction, and then
exactly.
Sounds like when we meet next month, this is on the agenda to talk about how we plan both the pre-feedback and then the actual feedback to property owners. Important stuff.
But regardless of what happens, right, the ordinance is still in place, and there's still an interest in educating people and trying to get them to participate in landmarking. So
yeah.
There's really no reason to wait on some of that, right?
Right.
Yeah, you know, the notification that would all work. Since there are potential changes in the ordinance that might affect some of the decisions around landmarking, you know,
Fair.
but certainly the fact, congratulations, you're living in a historic home, let's talk. That communication certainly could go out under the current fabric of the ordinance.
Because the website is going to get launched soon, right? And under the umbrella of this new website that's going to create transparency of information about these properties throughout Lake Bluff, that could.
Yeah. That and you were asking where can commission members help, and that's part of it is populating that database. Now doing some research and helping to populate that database.
Like data entry?
No. It's like doing the research.
Depends what you're signing up for.
Going through lots of file drawers and researching information and cross-referencing with books and.
Yeah. So
it's interesting. It's fascinating.
It is interesting stuff.
And
you know,
frustrating.
The files are in the village?
They're
at the
all over the
museum.
place.
At the museum.
Yeah.
At the museum, there's files in Waukegan at the county building. There are files at Shields Township.
So what needs to be done from that perspective is actually to determine what a populated record for a homeowner looks like. If we had all the data that we wanted, what would that be? And then with that template, begin to fill in the information for the homes that we want to have a dialogue with. So do we, for example, do we want previous owners of that home? We have some of that. So we can identify when a home was sold and who purchased it for some situations. We have tax information from the county. That's a public record. So we could import that into our database. So we just need to talk about all the pieces of information that are available, what we think would be helpful to populate a document. I'm going to send out through Glenn to the entire commission, if Glenn reminds me tomorrow, a link to the Evanston Lakeshore Historic District, which is an online data repository that is complete. It's based off the same GIS technology that we're going to use for Lake Bluff Online, but it has lots of information already filled in, photographs, dates and places of additions or renovations to the home. So I'll send it around so people can take a look at it, because I think that's a pretty good beginning point to think about what we want to capture online. And if we can use the online tool, I think that's going to help us a lot in having one place to put every tidbit of information we find out about the village.
Even,
That's the beauty of that system. It's having it
Yeah.
all in one bucket.
Which is all public information already, right?
Some, not all of it. I mean, some of the history museum stuff is in the museum's archives.
But that was at one point, information that was in news, well,
Sure.
okay.
If I may, as a brief reminder, and happy to circulate this in anticipation of a future discussion. This is where we left off with this a couple months before the pandemic. So hopefully, I'm not a professionally trained consultant flow charter, right? What we have here is really the basic data that was captured and entered at one point from the village's historic surveys. That's just a spreadsheet with addresses and ratings and some of the bare bones details. From that, we'll generate basic survey forms and we'll time to a property in Lake Bluff, or Lake Bluff Online, excuse me. And then the same form, the same document exists with more details, but only in paper at the museum. So there is a data entry type piece. There are other sources we know exist at Lake County and at Shields Townships. And then that could be more creatively written from the museum's records and then from other miscellaneous source materials too. So our goal, again, before the pandemic hit and before, quite candidly, we lost the ability to physically access many of these documents, was to make a flow whereby volunteers would gather this up, we would supplement this basic survey form, and then we'd push it to Lake Bluff Online. And hopefully, as we get back some ability to physically access documents, as we get back, for example, Allie Caskey is joining us. She is not at Lake Forest College because they won't let her reside at Lake Forest College right now, I believe. As we get back some of our different options for volunteer labor and student assistance, things like that, that these options begin to open back up to us.
And the one thing that we have now that we didn't have when we put this flowchart together are the research that was done around the walking tours. So if the commissioners haven't looked at the walking tours, one thing that might be interesting is to look at our 24 and figure out what walk they're on, and then take a look at the walk and see what the information is that's there. Because if there's information about that home, any one of these, they're going to be on a walk. There's going to be information there. And since the walk is a summary, that means that there's more information available on that structure. But that's one way to get a contextual sense, just by using the museum material. Okay, anything else?
Mr. Chairman, I do have a brief report when we're
Okay.
ready. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you were asking for the commissioners or for me, so I do apologize. I'll keep it brief to still get us out of here before 8 o'clock, which I think is very good. 2 items. So the first, you'll recall, perhaps in June, July of 2018, this commission was involved in some review of 673 Maple Avenue owned by Rob Douglas. And so at that time, the commission granted a voluntary request for landmarking, and it also conducted and concluded an advisory review of a partial rebuild and an expansion to that structure. So that happened in 2018. They were granted zoning relief to complete that project. They didn't ultimately complete it, but now they are hoping to do so. Variations in the village, zoning relief generally in the village, and generally a best practice when we do things like this with construction is that these things are on a shot clock, if you would. You have a year to use it, or then you lose it. Similarly, we don't grant blanket exceptions. We grant them based on particular plans or for a particular purpose or so on. That's really the best practice uniformly with these things. One of the issues that's being changed in this new revision of the ordinance, right, is that language creating a shot clock is being put in. We're making clear that when you approve something, someone will have to act in a reasonable amount of time, 1 to 2 years, to actually use that authorization. When I say it's being put in, that means it doesn't exist now. So I only report this to draw your attention that 673 Maple Avenue will go back to the Plan Commission and Zoning Board of Appeals. They will have to get a variation again, and we will share the minutes of that prior consideration. We'll share this board's recommendation supporting that in 2018. But just understand that in our view, this does not require advisory review because the exact changes were subject to advisory review and were completed. So a bit of a technical report there, but just want to make sure everyone was aware of that. Those plans are in the Plan Commission's current packet, and of course, I'm happy to share those via email with anyone that's interested.
So they're doing exactly what they wanted to do 3 years ago, but never got around to?
That's correct. Exact,
Okay.
identical
Yeah.
plans.
Okay. Yeah,
So
we
it
don't
happens
need
to be convenient in this case, but
Okay.
again, from a best practice standpoint, not ideal. The other thing I would note also at the Plan Commission, so as I think you even heard a bit of tonight, you know, historic preservation in the village is certainly a part of the village's larger housing policy. Something the Plan Commission has been discussing for months now is this idea of accessory dwelling units. So when we hear some of the challenges that people in the village are facing as they grow older, as they start to look for alternative housing arrangements and forms, is just the idea that used to be permissible in the village and other places, which is that you would build a second, much smaller unit, and that you'd be able to lease that or live there or et cetera. So there's been some reviews of that. There have been some draft regulations thinking about how you would regulate the bulk of those if they were allowed. And I did just want to report that, here in Wednesday evening, 7 o'clock, we've retained an architect planner who's done, I think, some very interesting work around just showing the massing, the forms, how these things could be built in the village. So that's mostly a topic of general interest, but also, as you heard tonight, solutions like these could be part of what helps preserve some of the village's historic landmarks, preserve, a diversity of options for homeowners. So as it concerns the commission or maybe your individual interests, certainly would encourage people to stay tuned to that conversation.
What's the discussion around? I understand the massing of the unit, how big it is, where you put it in conjunction to the main house, where you put it in conjunction with neighbors. What's the discussion around who gets to live there? So because you could have it be wide open, you could have it be, related to owners, like a in-law situation.
Yeah.
Certainly. So at this time, there was some discussion around that in the sense of, traditionally it's called an in-law or a granny suite. And so do you want to make it in-laws? If you make those units and then, only very small universe of people can live there, does that become a disincentive or a disamenity? What's the practicality of enforcing it and so on? And their draft regulations, it really contemplates essentially two restrictions. The first is no short-term rentals, no rentals of less than 30 days. In an accessory dwelling unit, licensed, unlicensed, anything like that. That's current village regulation. And the second would be, if you're leasing the principal structure, you can't lease to an unrelated set of people for that accessory dwelling unit. So if you live in the principal, you can lease the accessory. If you live in the accessory, you could lease out the principal. But just trying to make sure we don't have that strange situation where one landlord in two completely separate transactions is leasing to two completely separate groups of people on the same property.
Mhm. Okay.
Interesting.
But could it also be for a caregiver?
Yes.
It could be for a caregiver.
Maybe lease, but just.
Yeah.
Cool.
The city of Lake Forest has tried to eliminate those for a generation or more. They're the old servants' quarters that were above the stables on the big properties there. And you get too many college kids living in them, and too many other people who got loud music and too many cars and things like that. So that had always created a problem in the past. There's been a sort of a sea change in how communities look at that now.
Yeah, it could be, it's good. Thanks for bringing it up, Glenn, because
It's
it
a good
could be
option.
an option, yeah, for some property owners in historic structures. That might be a nice option. All right, anything
That
else?
concludes my report.
Okay,
Great.
anything else from the commissioners?
Yeah.
Entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Motion second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Roll call vote, please.
Certainly. Member Bergman,
Yes.
Member George,
Yes.
Member Minor,
Yes.
Member Nickel,
Yes.
Chair Kraus.
Yes,
Motion carries.
thank you. And I promise no special meetings for a while. Thanks everybody for sticking with us on this.
Steve, I want to thank you for getting us to this point. You've gotten us,
Yeah.
you've gotten us over, you've gotten us to the 20-yard line. We haven't scored the full touchdown yet, but we've been laboring at this a long time. And
Yes, we have.
this, this is about the second or third time I've said this. You have pulled on the laboring oar to get this thing explained to everybody and put together. And finally, now we're able to present it to the village board. And I want to thank you for all your hard work and for helping us get to this point. So,
Well, thank you, and my shoulders ache, so
yeah.
I bet.
don't need to do any more rowing for a while. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks.
We'll be in touch.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night. Good night, everyone.
Good night.